Our lecture for this month of May. Wonderful to have everyone here. This morning we are delighted to introduce Dr. David Martin. David is also not only a historian but also a member of our council. David holds a PhD in history from the University of New England. His interests in history are broad-ranging. He has written on various aspects of Nazi Germany and is the author of Germany 1918-1945, Oxford 2001. For a lifetime, he has been interested in Australia during the period of the First World War, which, as you can see, is a topic he'll be presenting this morning. Originally from Armidale in northern New South Wales, he's conducted research into how that community was affected by the war. Dr. Martin has contributed to the History Teachers Association of the New South Wales Modern History Study Guide, including on Germany 1894 and profiles of Albert Speer and Ho Chi Minh. He has written numerous articles on modern history and book reviews for various terms. If you can put your hands together to welcome David Martin.
Okay, so the subject is mainly about the British learning curve, and that subject was touched upon 3 or 4 years ago at a meeting of this society, and within the context of the Battle of the Somme. And the conclusion at the end of that meeting was that the learning curve was a load of rubbish, because it was such a disaster, and it demonstrated the British hadn't learned anything. So I'm going to try and refute that today perhaps, but not only that will I be talking about a load of rubbish, but in the last quarter of the lecture I'll be suggesting that the AIF, our Aussie diggers, actually were taught something by the British, so that would seem to be almost impossible also. But anyway, let's so first of all I want to set up the a definition or how the learning curve came about.
Can you move that microphone just a little closer to you?
What do you want me to
The
speak?
microphone, it's sort of a... Can you move it closer to you, the microphone?
Do you want me to speak into it more clearly, do you?
Okay.
Okay.
We can't really move the microphone, you have to.
Okay, sorry, just an old gunner here.
Okay, sorry. Well, there's a lot about artillery in this. I want to start off with John Laffan, an Australian historian, which some of you may have read. That's his one of his most popular books, British Butchers and Battlers of World War I. And a couple of points out of it. The British World War generals, well, so he argued, notably Sir Douglas Haig, were responsible for the wholesale slaughter of British and Empire troops. Well, obviously Laffan is up in arms because he reckons a lot of Australian troops died because of Haig's leadership. Okay, that's one point. Probably the more important point for me is the dull and he says there's the dull and inflexible Haig and the other generally dull and unimaginative senior officers, British officers, stood firmly in the way of real change. So, you know, the British Army stood still and suffered lots of casualties. Anyway, so that's the argument, but it fits in. Oh, sorry, and the villain of the piece is Douglas Haig, Commander-in-Chief. He's responsible for all these people being slaughtered, and also because the army won't change, and he's a cavalry officer and he's a fuddy-duddy and he's not interested in technology. Now the significance of Laffan for me or for the lecture is that it's just one example of a line of interpretation, and you could say it's the orthodox interpretation stretching back at least until the 1930s, beginning with Britain's wartime Prime Minister David Lloyd George and his memoirs, and military historian Basil Edelhart. So that argument is a development of something that's been around since the 1930s, perhaps at the extreme, an example of it. You can pick out other books too, such as Martin Middlebrook's First Day of the Somme. And if you haven't read any of those books, well, you've probably seen one of these movies, and they continue the same theme, only perhaps more pointedly. I would suggest reflecting a left-wing view from Hollywood, if indeed not a pacifist view, to make war look really stupid in the way it was run. The quote up the top right-hand side there is regarding all quite on the Western Front, from a German. It's the story of evil generals and poor soldiers sacrificed as cannon fodder. But I think you can apply that also to the British films as 97 and A Journey's End, so I'm suggesting the Western Front continues to be depicted as totally futile and devoid of competent generalship. So that's pretty much the orthodox point of view. Now I want to move on to Gary Sheffield, a professor, probably Britain's most high-profile military historian today. And we're going to leave it with him to explain the learning curve. Oh, sorry, this is his response to what I just read out to you. Myths of military incompetence and brutality are so deeply ingrained in British culture that it can still seem difficult for some to grasp that the First World War commanders, the British commanders, but perhaps all of them, were not actively attempting to massacre their men. It didn't make any sense to him as a military historian what he was hearing from the books. And remember, I drew to your attention that book earlier on, and it was written in, I think, 1988. So we're going to go back to the early 90s, and Gary Sheffield then was a lecturer at Sandhurst, Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. And he draws our attention to that pub in London, and it's just around the corner from the Imperial War Museum. And he tells us that he had quite a few seminars there after working in the Imperial War Museum with his mates over a few pints. And these are the types of people he was dealing with. In Beckett, he was also a lecturer at Sandhurst, Paddy Griffith was. Beckett's gone on to be a professor of military history. Coming from around the corner and joining in these seminars was Peter Simpkins, who was the Imperial War Museum's senior historian at that time. And Peter Simpkins came up with the term learning curve. So these are all First World War specialists. And out of that, this idea came, and Gary Sheffield grabs hold of it and develops it. So the idea originates in the early 1990s, and it's a response to those things you see in the movies that you see these days. Okay, so this is fairly central to the talk. Gary Sheffield explaining what the learning curve is. The First World War saw a transition in the conduct of warfare. Now you could substitute for the word transition, perhaps modernisation. You start off with Napoleonic or 19th century ideas and soldiers marching along, progressing, attacking in straight lines slowly. And you've got there backing them up the cavalry on horses. So that's the old way of doing things. At the other end, by 1918, you've got tanks, you've got aircraft, you've got machine guns, etc. And he goes on to say, the British Army played a leading part in it. Now the key aspect of that is, it played a part in it, the leading part, but there are others too involved in learning curves. The Germans were, the French were. So in all time, across all time, armies are changing, but especially during wartime. That's when it really accelerates. And the British weren't the only ones, but they were the main ones. In 4 years, the 1914 to 18 thing, it evolved from a small professional force of full-time soldiers. Now, the key thing is into a large citizen army of volunteers and conscripts. We'll develop that later on. Learning literally how to fight on the job. The civilians had to learn to fight on the job, but so did their officers. They'd never been involved in this type of war before. So, it's all coming back to the idea of the learning. It was a mighty act of improvisation. As I said, they've never had to deal with a war like this before. They had to improvise, they had to create. Historians have highlighted the BEF's learning curve, and he's closely associated with it. He changes emphasis a little bit, more accurately described as a learning process. So it's been criticised. It looks very clear and straightforward and onward and upward, and a clear line of development, but in reality it wasn't that straightforward. Anyway, it involved new technology and new techniques, new tactics emerged by a process of trial and error. For example, with their artillery and their creeping barrages, which we'll talk about, it resulted in about 10% of casualties to the British side. So, you know, there were problems. It wasn't clean and clear cut. Anyway, and it was incorporated into a way of fighting that reached a peak of effectiveness in 1918. That's where we're heading. That's the proof that they had learnt, not the Battle of the Somme, which is right at the bottom of the curve, I would suggest. Okay, in 2002, Gary Sheffield finally puts all his ideas together in this book, Forgotten Victory. So what was the victory he was talking about? During the climactic 100 days of victory, the last 100 days of the fighting in 1918, the British Army won the greatest series of battles in British military history. That's the evidence that Sheffield puts forward for they've learned something, the learning curve. That's where they arrive. And the type of warfare they're fighting is a modern type of warfare. I want to go back chronologically now to the outbreak of the war. So that headline is the 5th of August. On the 4th of August, Great Britain declared war on Germany, which we don't have time to investigate. And on the 5th, this gentleman was co-opted as a member of the British War Cabinet. Horatio, what's his name? Horatio Kitchener. Yes, that's it. And he wants you to join up. So one of the jobs he's got is to raise volunteers for the army. And it says there an addition of 100,000 men for His Majesty's army is immediately necessary. So you've got a regular army, and he wants to add to that 100,000 men. And how long does he want to do this in? Well, perhaps 6 months, perhaps longer. They might raise more. He's actually not got it in mind to send this big raised army into Europe until 1917. Going to do it at a leisurely place. They might wear themselves out by then. The British will come in and they will impose their ideas of the settlement. But there's a spanner in the works. On the 30th of August, there's a special Sunday edition of the Times. Apparently in those days, the Times wasn't published on Sunday. But this is a special one, and it featured an article reporting that after encountering German troops in France, the British Army was on the verge of disintegrating. Now, it wasn't propaganda, but it wasn't an accurate report. That was an exaggeration. But it had this effect. In 5 weeks, about 500,000 civilians volunteered for the British Army, and it continued. Between 1914 and the end of 1915, 2.5 million, emphasising million, had volunteered to join the British Army. Okay, now they're not set up to deal with that many people, so they've got to learn how to fight. At the time, in August 1914, that's how many regular soldiers there were in Britain. There were 6 infantry divisions and 1 cavalry division. And Kitchener had already taken some of those and sent them to the continent, the regulars. So he was keeping back the volunteers. They've got to train and require a lot of time. So he sends 4 infantry divisions of the 6. He keeps 2 behind, and he sends the cavalry division to France, and they call it the British Expeditionary Force. The British Expeditionary Force had been fully deployed by about the 15th September 1914, and it consisted of that many, 163,000. It would rapidly expand, this is the thing I want to emphasise, to more than 2 million by 1917, by including mostly either civilian, there's the emphasis, volunteers and conscripts. But also, and this is the second part of the lecture, also forces recruited in Australia and other dominions. Now, let me explain it later on. I want to suggest that the Australians that were arriving to become part of the British Expeditionary Force were by and large raw soldiers, just civilians in uniform, put aside Gallipoli. And so the British Expeditionary Force consisted of lots of people who'd never been to war before. Anyway, I talked about the British Expeditionary Force. Here's the Western Front that they're going to be going to. On the middle of September 1914, the British started digging trenches. By October, that's the extent of trenches that they were occupying. by the middle of 1916, just before the attack on the Somme. That's the stretch of trenches that they're involved with. Just one thing to point out about this is that they're the junior partner of the French, who occupies all of the line down to Switzerland. I think there's some Belgians to the north of it. But they, in that period of time, they didn't learn very much. They've got a lot to learn. In the time that we're dealing with, from 1914 until 1917, there are about, you can identify about 10 significant attempts to overcome the stalemate. 6 of those are launched by the British, and they don't achieve anything. The most they achieve at the Somme is they go forward about 9 kilometres by a 32-kilometre front, and that's in 180 days. So effectively, no one can break the stalemate. If they look like breaking the stalemate, the other side can bring in reinforcements and plug the gap. To start with, they're so stupid, the attacking side, that they send out hints that they're about to attack. The other side is ready for them. But even if they attack with a degree of surprise, the other side still has time, and you're getting nowhere. You've got this stalemate bogged down, and neither side is able to overcome the trench lock, the deadlock of trench warfare. The reason that most obviously comes to mind is the machine gun. If you had to nominate it, people would say that. Okay, Peter Simpkins helps us a little bit, this quote from there: "Of all wounds suffered by British soldiers during the conflict, 58% were inflicted by artillery shells and trench mortars, projectiles, whereas slightly less than 39% were from machine gun and rifle bullets." Okay, so yeah, there's evidence for the machine guns there, but it is essentially, more than anything else, an artillery war. Artillery dictated the nature of the fighting on the Western Front. And if you want to break the front line, you're going to have to deal with the German artillery, and you're going to have to stop them firing at you. Obviously, you're going to have to do it with the machine guns too. Okay, back to 1916. The Germans attack Verdun, and nothing is achieved apart from lots of casualties. And then the British come to the aid of their senior partner on the 1st of July and attack, and not much is achieved apart from heavy casualties. So it just fits in with it. We've got trench gridlock. Yet military historians, I don't know how many, some, identify the Battle of the Somme as the starting point of the British Army's learning curve. It proves nothing at all, really, apart from it's a disaster. And that's the argument that I'll be developing. It's a bit simplistic, but I'm suggesting up until the Battle of the Somme in July 1916, the British Army and its effectiveness was flatlining. I could go back and quibble with that, but we'll just say, for argument's sake, it was flatlining. After July 1916, that's when things kind of speeded up. Because that bit of bloody experience brought home just how much there yet was for the BEF to learn about fighting trench warfare, if ever it were to be effective on the Western Front. So they've got civilians in uniform, they've got generals who've never fought in this type of conflict. It's a gigantic conflict. And the 3 of the leading industrial nations of the world are involved, firing at each other, and the thing that's asserted itself is weapons such as machine guns, etc. Okay, without explaining, going into all the things about the first day of the Somme, I'll just use as an example of how the British Army hits flat bottom on the first day of the Somme, advancing in slow-moving wave formation, straight lines, nice and steadily. It's been estimated that 97 of the 143 British battalions that attacked that day comprised volunteers, who only 18 months earlier had been civilians. They had received basic training, but had no experience of fighting warfare. Consequently, their commanders, I should have said this, that they're short of commanders, and one of the phrases that's been used are dugouts. They had to dig out of retirement some commanders to come and command the troops. So you have not got a particularly high level of ability amongst commanders. Some of them are old and doddering. believed their men were capable of, they didn't think much of the men. They didn't want civilians in uniform. They thought they were capable of obeying the most basic of orders, certainly nothing tactically complex. They presumed most of their men could do no more than walk slowly forward in straight lines. When the barrage ended on command, they had been trained specifically. Training is an important concept in all of this. These men had been trained specifically to climb out of the trenches and proceed into no man's land at a steady pace, in old school linear straight line formations. This is what appears to have happened in about 80% of cases, and they just get mowed down. But just taking the first day. On the 1st of July 1916, the worst day in British military history, the attack resulted in a total of almost 58,000 British casualties and 90,240 killed. What about the Germans? German casualties estimated to have been only 8,000. The overall casualty ratio being something like 7 to 1 in favour of the German defenders. Okay, so that's a disaster. So what's going to happen? They can continue for another 140 days. Why do they continue? It can be summed up in one word: Haig. Haig wants them to go on. He's got this belief constantly when going into battles that the Germans are about to collapse. Their morale is shot. And all you have to do is keep on pressing them and you'll defeat them. And he continued to fight for 140 days and, well, so what can we say about Haig? Well, I'm just going back to this document that was published in 1909, Field Service Regulations. And the part in bold there was in the original. A firm determination in all ranks to conquer at any cost are the chief factors in success. He wants success and he's prepared to do anything to get it, and he doesn't really care about how many casualties are suffered by his side. So I would suggest that there is more than a grain of truth in this butcher-type interpretation. Okay, this is what happened as a result of the Battle of the Somme. It went on for 140 days. The British suffered 432,000 casualties, roughly 3,600 for each day of fighting. They captured an area approximately 9 kilometres deep by 32 kilometres wide, which in the great realm of things is not very much. Now, according to the estimate of the British official historian Edmonds, the Germans suffered between 660,000 and 680,000 casualties. Now, there's a lot of problem with the German archives because of bombing in the Second World War, and the winners write history and the losers don't keep all the records. Gary Sheffield, he has this to say about the Battle of the Somme. The Germans could not afford to lose many troops, and although costly and not decisive, the Somme represents a British victory. I don't actually want you to take that seriously, but I'll quote now another piece of information. I rate highly an Australian military historian by the name of Robin Pryor. Now, using figures compiled by the German archives, Robin Pryor informs us that the Germans suffered only 240,000 casualties. Now, when you compare that with what the British lost, twice as many as that, almost, you can see there that you can ridicule what Haig achieved, if it wasn't an achievement at all. So my argument is, in wartime, traumatic setbacks such as the First Day of the Somme can act as a catalyst, forcing military organisations to re-evaluate themselves. This is what happened with the BEF, causing it to reinvent itself by greatly accelerating. I've chosen that word deliberately. I'm not suggesting that all of a sudden things changed. Things were happening, but then it's accelerated the development of new technology and tactics. Okay, so I'm suggesting after the first day of the Somme, all those 140 days, gradually they're going to learn how to fight a modern war. And the picture up the top there is Amiens, the 8th of August 1918. A fairly long quote. Paddy Griffith was one of Sheffield's colleagues, another lecturer at Sandhurst, and I think this is worthwhile looking at, this long quote. It's about British General Headquarters SS manuals. SS stands for Stationary Service. It's the one that printed all these materials, but it's a lot more than that. So, Stationary Service manuals. by the second half of the war, in other words, following on from the Somme, there was a high and ever-growing level of tactical skill within all British forces. That would also include the Australians. This was greatly helped by a sustained effort of training and doctrinal analysis, which was quite impressive. Now, just to get it down to the tin tacks. Questionnaires were often issued after attacks, and also debriefs. They were interviewed officers, but they also filled out questionnaires, carefully studied and then incorporated into revised training guidelines. So it went back into the training of the troops. It depended upon usually battalion commanders, the lieutenant colonels, and it was telling them how to train their troops. Now they were working out how to do it. It's fairly crucial in this that they are properly trained. Right at the end I'll suggest they weren't all properly trained, but the British were working out how to win the war, and if you properly trained your troops in the conclusions that you drew, they tended to be successful. 1917 should be seen as the classic time, the BEF's manual production, as the lessons of the Somme were digested and disseminated. Now you've got a few examples there, but it's the one on the left-hand side, SS 143. I think that's probably the crucial one. This is SS 143, and on the right-hand side there, you can see, I think it's page 21 if my eyes are correct. And look, there are many ways. It was left up to the lieutenant who was in charge of a platoon as to how he would lead his men into battle. So, you know, the beginning point is this is the opposite of a straight line of slowly advancing troops. It's left up, it's a devolution of responsibility, not being told to do that by your commander, but it's leaving up to the troops on the spot, or particularly their lieutenant, as to what to do with the ideally 41 men under his control. Whatever it was, 41 men. Now, if you look at the key, if I can read this properly, the first group that's leading up are infantrymen with rifles and with probably bayonets attached. On the right-hand side there, you have bombers, which is apparently they're specialised in throwing hand grenades. On the left-hand side, you've got these rifle grenadiers who have this thing that stick down the barrel of their 303s and operated like a, would fire grenades just as a mortar would do. And finally, coming up the rear was 8 or 9 men with a Lewis submachine gun. And if you ran into opposition, the lieutenant would call them forward, they would attract the fire of, say, the German machine gunners, the others would go around the edges, or whatever tactics they worked out at the time. As I said, the key thing was a devolution of responsibility from command above to working out on the scene. So this is one of the things that they learned. The opposite of this, going forward slowly in wave formation. Just to add a little bit of complexity to it, the British weren't doing this all on their own, and quite frequently they learnt things from the French. French tactics, and they had been using something like this earlier on. The British learnt from the Somme, but they also learnt from the French. But it also happened that the British captured documents from the Germans, translated them, and the stationery service distributed those documents to the troops. And the other way around, sometimes British officers were captured with these types of pamphlets on them, and the Germans got hold of them. I haven't really read anything as to how either side of the opponents, what advantage they took of it. But anyway, I'm just trying to show you that it's extremely complex. This is, and another thing I should say, this is just about infantry tactics, which is fairly important. But there are whole lots of different types of learning curves. One of the ones that they've looked at these days is logistics. And they bring over, I think Geddes is his surname, from England, a train expert. And it's about logistics. How do you improve the movement of shells from England to France, and then getting them into the front line, and goodness knows what else. But anyway, I'm doing it in a rather simplified fashion and saying that infantry tactics are fairly important. And the Australians are part of the BEF, and there's a fairly iconic photograph of the Australians. Only 17 men in this one, not the ideal 41. Paddy Griffiths said the platoon of 1917-18 was an army in miniature. And if you look at the bottom line there, it carried the 41 ideal, carried 70 plus hand grenades, 48 rifle grenades, 3,300 rifle rounds, and 860 Lewis gun rounds. So that's the basic infantry unit, and they're making up decisions themselves rather than being told what to do. The Lewis gun provided platoons with a much enhanced firepower over time, enabling them to operate with increasing flexibility, independence and effectiveness. They got the Lewis gun from the United States, the idea. They introduced it into use in 1916. I think the Germans developed their own, not as effective. So they were copying each other. They both had learning curves. The British one was more effective and in the end quite productive. That's before the attack at Mons and Quinton, and there are only 11 Australians there, and you can see they've got amongst them, to share between them, 2 Lewis machine guns. I suppose the heading should be necessity is the mother of invention. You've got there a Lewis gun down the bottom, but there are all these other things that they rapidly developed. The Stokes mortar, they developed a new fuse for artillery. This one, previously lots of shells were burying themselves in the ground and they weren't exploding or doing various things. This one was a Gray's characteristic, the 106 fuse, and as soon as it hit the ground it exploded. So that's another development. Lots of different developments with aircraft. To start off with, they were just there for observing troop movements. Then the next thing is that they acted as spotters for artillery, and they gave them Morse code systems so they could actually send the information back and other things. And some people really emphasise the tank made all the difference. I'll make a comment about that later on. It was significant but not decisive. Now I've tried to kind of run down Haig saying how cold-blooded he was, and he wasn't very supportive of, well, he did worry much about how many men he sacrificed. However, I think to suggest, I think Sheffield was probably right here in this book he produced in 2011, that Haig was important in developing the technology. So he says Haig enthusiastically embraced the technology that we're talking about here and provided powerful institutional backing for tanks, aircraft. I'll just emphasise this one because it's one I'm about to go into. Advanced artillery techniques and the like. So I think it's incontrovertible, although once upon a time they called him a technophobe. He didn't like technology. They said, the reason for this is because he was an artilleryman. He was a cavalryman, and he just wasn't a 20th century man. I think Gary Sheffield has put that one to bed, that one. And he did encourage all these things because he wanted to win the war. And he could see these types of things in tanks, etc., will enable him to do it. So anyway, look, I want to have a look at advanced artillery technique because I suggested earlier on that the First World War was an artillery war. Okay, the first thing we're developing is the creeping barrage, sometimes talked about as a walking or rolling barrage. Now, the key part about this is when we get to France. On the 1st of July, the extreme right wing of the British attack on the Somme succeeded in capturing its objective in the southern sector, but only there. That's where the British met up with the French, and the French provided the artillery support. There, the troops followed close behind a creeping barrage fired by French artillery that moved steadily forward at a rate of about 50 metres every minute. It didn't happen elsewhere where the British were providing the artillery support. The result was that in the south, British infantrymen arrived at the German front line with defenders still stunned and incapable of putting up much resistance. So we're going back to this theme of, it wasn't only the British, they got some really good ideas from the French. So it succeeded there. So what happened? As of the 16th of July, British GHQ was recommending the use of creeping barrages whenever the VEF launched attacks. And by September, so we're still in the Battle of the Somme, it was standard practice for infantry to follow about 50 metres behind a creeping barrage, moving forward at about 100 metres every 4 minutes. And finally, in 1917, a creeping barrage could consist of 5 to 6 separate lines of bursting shells, a mixture of shrapnel and high explosive and smoke extending 1 to 2,000 metres, it's a very long distance for all these shells to be going off, with lines moving independently backwards and forwards to confuse defenders. Now, part of the reason that that is relevant is because up until the Battle of the Somme, the Germans had a front line and perhaps 1 or 2 lines behind it. But as a result of what happened on the Somme, they only lightly manned their front line, and they had a large defensive line with troops spread all over it, but not packed into the front. And with machine gun posts spread across the checkerboard arrangement. That's why you needed that type of creeping barrage. The purpose of the creeping barrage was not to kill the Germans and to blow up their weapons, although they'd like to do that, but to just keep them ducking for cover and not returning fire as the troops followed up behind the creeping barrage, and it did it very effectively. And there are the used shell casings from a single Allied creeping barrage. So, you know, if you're subjected to that on the German side, well, you're keeping undercover or in your underground bunkers. Anyway, the creeping barrage proved very successful in preventing German defenders from managing the parapet of their trenches and firing their machine guns and rifles into advancing troops, which is the cause of probably about 40% of British casualties. But what about the other casualties, the other 60%? However, about 60% of British casualties were caused by shells fired by German artillery, often located well behind their lines, so they're not going to be affected by the creeping barrage. Therefore, German artillery batteries needed to be the key word that the historian uses, neutralised, not destroyed but neutralised, before British infantry could advance across no man's land in relative safety. And the key development is counter-battery barrages. More than anything else, it's about counter-battery barrages. That's the answer to trench gridlock. Okay, we start with aircraft. First of all, they were used to spy, to detect troop movements, then to report to artillery. But here we've got the person in the rear cockpit there with a camera. And by the middle of the war, they had photographed nearly all of the Western Front. Now, what used to be made of the photographs? Well, sometimes multiple copies of photographs were distributed to the troops before they went into battle. But more importantly, they eventually mapped the whole of the Western Front. If you've got a map and also the artillery command has a map, you can give them the coordinates of where a target is and they can target it. To start with, the British had forward observation officers with telephones back to the artillery. And if you could have 2, 3 or 4 and you could triangulate the angle of where they saw the flash of the German artillery, you could work out pretty much where that artillery was and you could target it. The Germans woke up to this, so as the war progressed into 1918, they used to send up false flashes, and also they developed shells that did not produce much of a flash. But anyway, the main drawback, and a significant drawback to this flash spotting, was that most of the German artillery were not within eyesight. They went into direct line of sight. They would be on the reverse slope of hills, so you actually couldn't see them. And that's where you get this really crucial development, sound ranging. And if you wanted, you could argue it was as a result of an Australian by the name of William Lawrence Bragg. Anyway, if you look at the diagram there, you can see a lot of wiggly things coming out of some microphones. And then they went back to a machine that's there. And please don't ask me, somebody might know better than me, but out of this, they're going to work out how they can locate from the sound of the shells whereabouts German artillery is long range on the reverse side of slopes, and this is crucial. On the outbreak of war, Adelaide-born Bragg So he was born in Australia, but his father was a kind of a science lecturer, come to Adelaide, and by the time the war broke out, Bragg himself, the son, was a science lecturer at Cambridge, and he joined the British Army. On the 19th of July 1915, he was seconded, Bragg, to the map section of British GHQ. From September 1915, he was involved in research to locate German artillery from the sound of its firing shells, and then I put in italics, which the French had been investigating. So the French were involved in the learning process. Now Bragg takes up what they've been doing and develops it. By June 1916, Bragg had found a solution, which was in general use by November 1917. Now, I'll read this, but I don't especially understand it all. Using Tucker microphones produced back by the post office in Britain, microphones were set up in a line about 10 kilometres long. It required lots of equipment. Well, when an enemy artillery piece fired, the precise time was recorded at which the shell crack reached each microphone, thereby enabling the gun's position to be calculated to an accuracy of about 50 metres. I'll come back to that. Eventually, hundreds of sound ranging machines were built to facilitate counter-battery work. Okay, but only to an accuracy of about 50 metres. So, you're getting fairly close to them, and this is where the final piece of the jigsaw puzzle comes in. Here's a quote from a BF Manual 1917, Artillery Notes number 3. And it advised, now the Germans had used gas before, then the British started to use it. So there's another example of this learning curve thing. The Germans first, the British second, and the gas we're talking about largely is mustard gas. The British are being advised this with their artillery. Gas shells are particularly valuable in counter-battery work for neutralising hostile batteries, not destroying them, but neutralising them immediately prior to and during an attack, and should be employed in large quantities. Now, eventually, about 50% of all shells used in counter-battery work had mustard gas in them, or gas anyway, I think largely mustard gas. Now, gas shells are called area weapons. They hit, and then the gas spreads out, and the more shells you can fire, the bigger the cloud of gas. That's the key to it all. Okay, the Germans have got gas masks, etc. But if you can saturate it enough, even the gas masks they've got are not going to work. And at its worst, mustard gas is going to kill you. So once they were saturating where the German batteries were concerned, they didn't operate. And if you didn't operate, the troops could cross no man's land without being hit by shells. And in the meantime, the creeping barrage had stopped the machine guns. Finally, we come to the Black Day of the German Army, the 8th of August 1918, and the Battle of Amiens. Prior to the battle, this is the beginning of the 100 days. Remember, Gary Sheffield said that this proved the learning curve was correct, and finally the British Army was fighting like a modern army. Prior to the battle, aerial observers, flash fighters and sound rangers identified 95% of the 530 German guns. The battle commenced with counter-battery bombardments right at 0 hour. So now surprise has returned to the battlefield. You don't have to go on for days ranging and working out where your shells are hitting. They've developed the ability instantaneously firing off the map to hit the opposition, in this case, or get pretty close to their artillery, targeting any enemy artillery so effectively that Allied troops were able to attack with very few shells being fired at them by the Germans. In addition, the attacking infantry followed creeping barrages that were so effective that German machine gunners were largely neutralised. And this is the beginning of the 100 days. Okay. There you've got, the map is the 100 Days campaign went from the 8th of August to the 4th of November 1918. It's not exactly 100 days, give or take a few days, I can't remember which. It was preceded by the Second Battle of the Marne, the French, but then the 100 days began on the 8th of August, the Battle of Amiens. Now, all told, you can identify at least probably 26 individual battles that took place that contributed to the 100 days. I'm just going to give you some of them in this sequence of what happened in August, September, but I didn't have the time to put all of them onto the one map. So this is what happened. So the British attack there, the French there. British another attack there. The Australians then contributed with very little support. Mons and Quinton, pretty significant. The French and the Americans down there, French and Americans down there, British, okay. So this is the conclusion as regarding tactics or strategy or whatever. Through bitter experience, I have to explain this, I have to come back and make a few points. Through bitter experience, BEF commanders had learned not to fight. Now notice I'm not saying Haig, I'm saying his commanders had learned not to fight another Somme-like bloody 140-day battle. Rather, in late 1918, they fought a high-tempo campaign of limited attacks equals 3 or 4 days at most attacks, then you go somewhere else, across the whole length of the Western Front, to which the Germans found it increasingly difficult to respond. No, they could respond to 1 or 2 or whatever, but eventually they just could not contain all these various attacks. Now, there are 2 things I want to explain about this, and going back to the Battle of Amiens, it got really well for about 3 days, and then Haig decided, well, we're going to press on. We're going to be like the Battle of Somme. We're just going to keep on boring on. And he was fronted by his senior commander, Henry Rawlinson, and said, no, you know, in the past this has produced nothing but casualties. Left it for a few more days. Rawlinson fronts him again. And in the meantime, Haig had done a bit of private investigation. He found that Rawlinson wasn't on his own. That, for example, Arthur Currie, who was in charge of the leader of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, he was also of the same mind as Rawlinson. Now, Arthur Currie was quite different. That Rawlinson would have to do what he was told to do by Haig, but Currie was in charge of the Canadians, and he had the right, if he wanted to refer to his own government, not to obey such orders. And what did Haig do? He shut up and just went into the background, and it went along this high-tempo campaign. Another thing that's said by military historians is the significance is that the overall person now in charge of the whole thing was the Frenchman Foch. He was the generalissimo in charge of the whole thing, and this idea of a high-tempo campaign, you've got to give him a lot of credit for it. Anyway, it certainly wasn't Haig. It had gone into other hands by this stage. So what happened? Well, that's what happened. The Germans couldn't put up with it anymore, and they sued for an armistice. And it happened on the 11th of November. Why? The German army was not defeated. It hadn't been destroyed, but it was kind of on the verge of disintegrating, and the next thing would have been that the Allied troops would have been on German soil. That's why they sued for an armistice. So the end of the war. Now, if I've got time, hopefully, about the Australian Imperial Force. Notice I'll emphasise their Imperial. What were the ramifications of the British Army's learning curve for the Australians, who were part of the AIF? Sorry, BEF. The Australian Imperial Force was a component part of the British Expeditionary Force fighting within its core structure using British equipment and doctrine under the overall command of the British High Command. Okay, numbers. The British had about 2 million or thereabouts under its command along the Western Front. How many Australians were there? At any one time, typically about 120,000 Australians. So 120,000 out of about 2 million troops. There are about 60,000 Australians back in Britain at any one time, wounded, training at AIF headquarters. As a result, okay, I don't know, this might be contentious, so please think of what questions you might subject me to. As a result of being embedded within the BEF, the AIF adopted the changes resulting from what the BEF was learning simultaneously and automatically. So my big argument, well, it's not mine as you'll see, as a direct consequence of being a component of the BEF, the AIF rapidly developed that high degree of military proficiency it would never ever have attained had it been an autonomous military force. Okay, So where do I get my information from? Well, I'm drawing very much upon this historian, Robert Stevenson, who retired from the regular army as a lieutenant colonel, and I'm using his book, The War with Germany, 2015. It's not his own publication. Yeah, he did publish it on his own as part of the Oxford Official History of the Centenary of the First World War. He rubbishes the idea that Australians, because they grew up in Australia and there was bush and all that, that this made them ready to go out and be soldiers and they were good shots, etc. But he also says that Gallipoli didn't either. Now, I've got my own addition to this. He said the AIF performance on Gallipoli, where there are much in trenches and not very much artillery on our side, while commendable for a novice army, taught the Australians little about the type of war they would face on the Western Front. And I add, but even so, less than 15% of the AIF who served in Gallipoli then went on to fight elsewhere on the Western Front. The argument I'm trying to develop here is, again, we're dealing with civilians. Most of the recruitment in Australia for the AIF only began after the Gallipoli landing occurred, and filling people with pride and you know what. And most of them, at best, were still training in Australia after they evacuated from Gallipoli. So the idea of Gallipoli veterans then being the AIF is not the case. Less than 15% of them were Gallipoli veterans on the Western Front, probably even less than that because some of them stayed in the Middle East and fought there. Okay, now Robert Stevenson, being a bit of a smart ass, says uniforms were the one item Australia insisted on providing from its own stock. So you can see him standing there. The Australian government insisted on maintaining its army in its national uniform. Australian soldiers were dressed distinctly in the Australian pattern uniform. Perhaps, you can see from the footnote, only perhaps and probably not, some of their 303 rifles were made at Lithgow, but probably not. They probably were provided by the British. Now, this thing about stability. Stability enabled the AIF to master British tactics generally better than the British. So the argument is the British have got the formula as to how to win the war. All you had to do was apply it, and they apply it. The Australians apply it better than the British. Well, you can make your judgment. Okay, Stevenson said a complex process eventually made the diggers successful. Armies do not win battles because of a handful of maverick individuals, not kind of like the Paul Hogan type, knockabout individuals. That's a lot of rubbish. This is real warfare, this. He says, success depends upon task-oriented bodies of trained and disciplined colleagues. What really shaped the AIF was the training and administration. Nothing to do with you being an Australian. The AIF was granted stability denied most British formations. What happened was that, say, a British division might be moved from one British army to another one constantly. One of the things they often talk about was what happened with casualties. Now, if you suffered a bad wound of some type, you then go back to England with a blighty, then you come back. What the Australians did invariably is they sent them then back to the same unit that they'd been involved in and developed this esprit de corps. But it appears as though that didn't happen with anybody else. You come back and go to any unit. And the units are being all moved around. The Australians fought together in the Australian Corps. Such stability allowed the Australian Corps to slowly develop common procedures and made it easier to learn the British lessons and embed those lessons in training. Over the winter of 1916-17, the BF expanded the school system for officers and NCOs, etc., as it simultaneously promulgated advanced doctrine derived from the lessons of the Somme. Hundreds of Australian junior officers and NCOs attended BEF-designed courses that taught the new platoon tactics. A typical AIF battalion spent nearly a third of its entire service engaged in some sort of training. Training is fairly crucial, and you're being trained in British methods. Training was a regular feature of the digger's life. And here's his big theme of the whole book. And despite the mythology of the natural soldier, the digger, one of the key reasons the AIF became so effective on the battlefield was the amount and quality of the AIF's training and they've been training according to the British formula. Okay, just to itemise it a bit, in most technical and tactical areas, the AIF was an imitator rather than an innovator. It didn't create any of these things, it just did what the British did. Regarding the artillery, by September 1917, a level of standardisation and sophistication had been achieved throughout the BEF's artillery, which meant that the infantry could generally rely on any gunners commanded by a competent commanding officer. Now, fitting in with the Australians, inexperienced AIF batteries, which were used mainly for creeping barrages and stuffs, learned these techniques from the more experienced British gunners, either at British schools or by local observation. And perhaps the most important thing, the importance of AIF adherence to BEF practice is obvious in the adoption of BEF's platoon doctrine. A photograph that Stevenson uses, he points out that the gun was provided by the British, the horses were provided by the British, the limbers were provided by the British, the ammunition, all the ammunition the AIF used was provided by the British, and the Australian gunners had been trained to follow British doctrine and practice. And here is a group of infantrymen training in a very disciplined fashion as to how to use Lewis guns that had been provided by the British. Obviously an interesting one, it appears that AIF outpaced the British with the development of certain training programs, such as those involving live fire exercises. From early 1917, AIF platoons and companies undertook drills that sometimes used live ammunition and bombs, ready for that, hand grenades, enabling tactics to be practiced under realistic conditions. I found that interesting. Look, just a few very brief comments about a few battles. Hamel, held up as, oh, gee, aren't the Australians great? I'm suggesting that BEF, it should be seen as in terms of BEF best practice of fully mature British offensive doctrine of all arms warfare. Took 93 minutes, but the battle commenced with the British counter-battery fire and it silenced most of the German artillery. Then the creeping barrage was adopted that the British had developed, silencing most German machine gunners. And then they were accompanied by British tanks, and I don't know whose ground attack aircraft they were, but the Australians took it. It's a fully matured example of British attack doctrine. That photograph again, which I think is the best one around, and this is what happened at Monson Quick. This is the ultimate for the Australians. It demonstrated how spectacularly effective Australian troops could be when employing BEF platoon tactics, revolving around use of the Lewis light machine gun. You might want to contest some of this, but I'm suggesting that it reflects how well they applied British tactics. Reduced to an average of 330 men per battalion, the Australians were outnumbered, possibly by as much as 3 to 1, with some German defenders being elite troops. They just weren't demoralised, rubbish troops. The Australian attack did not have overwhelming artillery support to neutralise the many machine guns employed by the defenders, nor were they supported by any tanks. Nevertheless, they advanced manoeuvring around German machine gun post and capturing 30 machine guns. You might see this as going beyond what I've been arguing. There's an X factor here, what the Australians were doing. This is the ultimate in what the Australians achieved. The beginning point was that they were drilled in British tactics and they were using British weapons, etc. But I think perhaps we've gone beyond that. Okay, this is what Stevenson said, but most of them say this. So we can think about this. The Australian Corps emerged as one, notice the selection of his word, one of the most effective fighting formations of the BEF. Now the way he presents it, they were ranked alongside the Canadians and the New Zealanders. But I'll add this too. He says this, but not only he, but Sheffield, and they all say it. But there were also equal on the same level. Many outstanding British divisions, such as the Guard, etc., it goes on. Okay. But it introduces another different aspect. If the British had the formula, why wasn't the BEF uniformly superb? And the effectiveness of British troops depended largely upon the commander who trained them. Sometimes they had pretty hopeless commanders. If you had a good commander, the troops were pretty good. And Stevenson is suggesting they're all pretty much equal. I don't know how on earth you decide which is better than any other. These are the conclusions, just summarising everything. The British Expeditionary Force, pretty bad on the Battle of the Somme. It embarked upon a steep learning curve, developing type of technology and tactics needed to operate effectively on the battlefield. And then, arriving on the Western Front in April 1916, the Australian Imperial Force was ill prepared to fight the industrialised warfare being fought there. But as a component of the BEF, it would be the direct beneficiary of its period of introspection and experimentation, what the British were doing. The BEF provided Australians with the tactical know-how and material support needed to succeed on the Western Front. The way Australian troops applied the BEF's lessons resulted in the AIF emerging as one of the BEF's elite formations, and if you so like, you could argue possibly the best. It's the end, and there's where I get some more information from. Thank you.